The United States and Russia have concluded the first round of security talks over Ukraine. What were the main takeaways? Hello, I'm Andrij, and this is The Heat. As expected, there were no major diplomatic breakthroughs in what officials say will be a lengthy process to address US-Russia tensions over Ukraine and other security issues. Russian officials are now slated to meet with NATO in Brussels. CGTN's Lyubova gives us the latest.
That's right. So the talks between the United States and Russia have concluded here in Geneva. They took place at the US mission to the United Nations in Geneva, and the talks were held mainly behind closed doors. They took place throughout the whole of Monday, and there was also a working dinner between the two sides on Sunday evening. Well, even, of course, the talks were held behind closed doors. We still heard from both of the sides at the end of the talks, and from the Russian side, it was headed by the Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, and from the US side, it was Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman. They both spoke to the press, and the Russian side, Sergei Ryabkov, said that Russia doesn't plan to invade Ukraine, but said that Ukraine must never become a NATO member, and that is one of the red lines from Russia. But this is something that the United States said that was not for Russia to dictate. So no concrete decision has been made on Monday, but it's expected to be made at the end of this week. Of course, these talks in Geneva on Monday, they will be followed by talks in Brussels between Russia and NATO, and then also talks in Vienna between Russia and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So the sides will be trying to de-escalate this situation, the security situation in Ukraine, throughout this whole week. Both sides, even before these talks began on Monday, they said that they don't expect any breakthroughs because they have such a difference in opinions when it comes to Ukraine and NATO's expansion. So Russia, before it came to these talks, it had a set of demands. It said that it was seeking US guarantees that NATO will not expand to Ukraine and that the West will not deploy weapons near Russia's border. In the past, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, said that Ukraine's membership in NATO is a red line for the Kremlin. But of course, that's something that the United States said it's not for Russia to dictate. And so that's, of course, the big difference between them. So it remains to be seen if they can come to any agreements at all, if any, at the end of this week.
That report there from Lyubova. Well, to discuss this and more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Bethesda, Maryland, is Michael O'Hanlon. He is a senior fellow and director of research in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. From Providence, Rhode Island, Vladimir Golstein is the chair of the Slavic Studies Department at Brown University. From New York, Andrij Dobriansky joins us. He is the chair of United Nations Affairs at the Ukrainian World Congress. And here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. Welcome to all of you to the show. Anton Fedyashin, 8 hours of talks in Geneva. Russia assured the United States that it has no plans to invade Ukraine. And the Americans, for their part, they were led by the seasoned diplomat Wendy Sherman. They said that she pushed back against Russia's demands that Ukraine not be admitted to NATO. And, you know, as we've just heard, we didn't expect any kind of major diplomatic breakthrough. But what was your reading of what transpired?
Well, we now have to wait for the next two meetings this week, and I don't expect that they will produce any clean or clear results. The positions of the two major countries involved here, Russia and the United States, are fundamentally different, especially on the issue of NATO expansion. And so in order to go forward, they're both going to have to give something up, and that may be where the diplomats will have to come in and come up with formula that on the surface do not impede the possibility of NATO expansion, but de facto somehow assuage Russian security concerns. And this may take weeks, despite the fact that the Russians have repeatedly said that they want quick results, but they have absolutely no levers with which to produce those.
Michael O'Hanlon, as Anton just pointed out, the two sides are very far apart on the main issue on NATO membership. Wendy Sherman, who, as I said, is leading the U.S. delegation, was adamant about possible membership of NATO. She said, and I'm quoting here, "We will not allow anyone to slam close NATO's open door policy." Unquote. And therein lies the problem, isn't it? I mean, Russia wants this assurance from NATO, and NATO is not prepared to give that. But the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, who led the Russian side, he was very positive. He said, look, the talks were long, very professional, deep, concrete, without attempts to gloss over any sharp edges. Where do you see this going?
It's an excellent question. You know, I don't think NATO has any reason, frankly, to want more members at this point, especially in the former Soviet space. And NATO was never designed to be a democracy promotion instrument as much as we believe in democracy in the United States. This is a military alliance where one commits a somewhat unnatural act of promising to defend some other country as if it were one's own territory. I think those kinds of alliances are useful, including in East Asia, but they should be made very judiciously. And so I think there is a conversation to be had, which I've been advocating for years, about rethinking security architectures for Eastern Europe. Simply growing NATO, to me, is not the right answer. Americans, I don't believe, really are that desirous of committing their sons and daughters to being able to go and defend those countries. They're so far away. They're much more important to Russia than to us, in geographic terms at least. And we have other ways, I believe, to try to promote their security. Promising them NATO expansion, which happened 14 years ago, has not enhanced their security. So I don't want to support Vladimir Putin. His tactics are terrible. And the fact that he is the one advocating for a new concept is actually counterproductive for those of us like me who want to see it anyway. Because, of course, Putin does not enjoy a good reputation anywhere in the West, and this is seen as bullying. But I don't think it's realistic or desirable to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. So we need a different conversation with different kinds of options, with both sides being willing to respect and uphold the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine and Georgia and other countries without alliances. And that's going to be a harder conversation to have when Putin is pointing a dagger at the heart of Ukraine. But it's the conversation we have to have at some point.
Well, we could see some creative diplomacy to come. But Andrij Dobriansky, what do you make of what Michael O'Hanlon just said, that there is no need for NATO to take on more members, and there isn't really an appetite in the United States to get into any kind of conflict over this?
The United States is typically the last to go into war. American citizens weren't that excited to get into the Civil War, weren't that excited to get into World War I or World War II. However, when the time comes, America does make sure to defend its allies. What NATO has done, what this amazing alliance has done, has secured the peace in Europe for many, many years in a way that the previous millennium could not even dream of. Also, what this policy of open doors, which is an ongoing policy, nobody from NATO says that they will ever close doors at this point. And I should also remind everybody that Ukraine's constitution itself portends that Ukraine one day will be a member of NATO. What this alliance does as well is ensure the fact that these nations that enter into this alliance will not then become enemies of any of the members of the alliance. That really helps the United States, and every country that joins the alliance has yet another opportunity for diplomacy and interoperability with each other.
But Andrij, do you also agree with Michael O'Hanlon's point that, look, Ukraine's security may not lie totally with membership in NATO? There needs to be some kind of security architecture in Europe, and that might not mean NATO membership.
Ukraine had several bilateral treaties with Russia that was completely broken. So that may be a pipe dream of people to have a deal with Russia, but clearly that's not a way of keeping peace in the world. What is most important is not just Ukraine's, again, immutable and a non-changeable fact that it will one day be a member of NATO, as both NATO and Ukraine have pledged, but also the fact that Ukraine is now working more and more with its neighbors. That includes its neighbors, Moldova, Georgia, as well as the Three Seas Initiative of Lithuania and Poland. There are now military brigades that are cooperating of three countries, making sure that whatever Russia plans on doing, all these countries that are in danger of being attacked by Russia can work together.
Vladimir Golstein, on Ukraine, Sergei Rubkov, who led the Russian delegation, he said, I'm quoting here, something that we need to the Americans is unacceptable. And that is bad because it shows they underestimate the gravity of the matter, unquote. Vladimir, this is not something new. In fact, Russian President Vladimir Putin said just a couple of weeks ago, every time we tried to push back against NATO expansion, we were told, in his words, to buzz off with your concerns. Do you sense that this is still the American position, that it's our way or the highway?
That's how sort of America keeps on sounding, and that's how Wendy Sherman is sounding. That's how Secretary of State Department Blinken is sounding. But, you know, like everybody else says, the very fact that there are conversations between Putin and Biden, between Rybkov and Sherman, it all tells us that, you know, they are trying to listen. But I think it is a very essential issue for Russians. They're very nervous about it. You know, they also feel, you know, NATO has history. It's not just it just happened only yesterday, and you know, Ukraine as a victim of Russia want to join. We're talking about NATO when Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union. The minute, you know, the whole thing began to unravel in the Soviet Union, NATO was promising not to expand. There were talks by you know, all concerned people from Germany to United States that they wouldn't even push a NATO into Germany, let alone other countries. That continued. And what is important, I agree with Michael, that this is not so much Russian concern, it's American concern, but somehow kind of because there are issues of Russia and Putin and Ukraine, people forget about it. It's very serious Ukrainians, including George Kennan, warned not to expand NATO. It's counterproductive. So as a result, this pushing, this you know, expanding, you know, it just brings bad blood in Russia and brings aggression. So I just want to remind the audience that there was, like, you know, this conversation with Russia shouldn't be included and shouldn't be considered brings absolutely the worst. You know, when there was a coup with this Maidan, you know, revolution in Ukraine, and you know, new leadership came over, Russia said, let's sit at the table and discuss the plight of fleet, of Crimean fleet, of North Black Sea fleet, to which he was told, you're not going to tell us what to do. It's between us and Ukraine, and we'll decide. Lo and behold, Putin sort of responded into Crimea. That's the way. So I think what basically all essential, you know, leaders have to realize that this is indeed a red line, and that's what Putin is trying to convey. And you know, one hopes that it will be heard one way or another, and solution will be found one way or another.
Anton, Fedyashin, the big focus on the part of the media has been on the situation in Ukraine, on the border with Russia. But if we look at those proposals, which were issued by the Russians a couple of weeks ago when the talks first started, Russia is looking for a much broader agreement that will essentially define the European security landscape for decades. It's not just about Ukraine. What is the broad agreement that Russia is looking for?
Well, this is something that the Russians have brought up on numerous occasions, including in 2008 when Dmitry Medvedev was the president, and also in the 1990s under Yeltsin, although back then Russia was in absolutely no condition to really command anyone's attention. But this is really a sort of recalibration of transatlantic security. This will necessitate some kind of profound rethinking of NATO and its place in international security, especially vis-a-vis Russia. The Russians are arguing that they should be brought in, and they'll be happy to make whatever commitments on a mutual basis that the West is willing to make with them. So yes, this is a major rethinking of global architecture, certainly Eurasian architecture, security architecture, and it doesn't sound like the West is prepared to do this. Listen, NATO's been expanding with a one-size-fits-all sort of policy, as has the EU, which is what got Ukraine into the mess that it found itself in 2014. So whether any kind of creative thinking and meeting each other halfway will take place, I guess we'll be finding out this week and then in the following weeks. I will say one thing, I seriously doubt that the Russians are going to be invading Ukraine anytime soon. It's worth remembering that it's now the poorest country in Europe, driven into the ground by its recent government. So there's really not much that the Russians are going to want there. And if there is military action, God forbid, it certainly won't come in the form of World War II era type massive tank and artillery and army invasions. It will be something different.
Michael O'Hanlon, what are your thoughts on Russia's desire to broaden this agreement to basically redefine European security that will remove all these tensions? We have to remember, of course, that NATO is made up of 30 states, ideologically different in terms of politics, economics, etc. So would there be, do you think, any desire on the part of NATO to enter into a long-term agreement?
I think these conversations were possible in the 1990s when we were first coming out of the Cold War, although as has been mentioned tonight, that was a period when the United States and other traditional long-standing NATO members decided to expand NATO. And there's still a debate about whether we broke our promise or if we sort of broke the spirit of the way that President Bush and Secretary Baker had handled the reunification of Germany. But in any event, we did not really wind up pushing that conversation too far. A conversation about a broader system of collective or cooperative security that could even include Russia in some sense, and whether you still called it NATO or you called it something else. That was a moment that some people wanted to have such a conversation. Today, even for those of us who favor a rethinking of NATO expansion, it's a pretty tough moment to have that conversation because of Putin's behavior and his reputation in the West. I've done some writing just in the last couple of weeks advocating for this kind of rethink, and there are very few things that I've written in the last few years that have gotten more in the way of vituperative, harsh criticism, because you're seen as somehow taking the side of this Russian bully, and he is a Russian bully. And I don't think his designs towards Ukraine are particularly noble, or that they're couched in just some desire to rethink European security structures that in a way that would benefit all. He wants a sphere of influence. He wants to dominate his neighbors, and he resents that some of those neighbors are already inside the very alliance that was set up to deal with Soviet aggression during the Cold War. And so in that sense, Putin's got a chip on his shoulder. He's out for a certain kind of revenge. He does want to weaken or dismantle NATO. He does want, I don't think he wants peace in Europe. I think he wants a zone near him that is dominated by Russia. And if that can produce peace, so be it. But it's got to be at the price of those countries being subservient at some level. So that's not a very good vision, and we shouldn't concede it. But that's separate from saying that we should therefore want to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, knowing full well what reaction that's going to produce. My friend at Brown University mentioned earlier tonight that George Kennan was against the expansion of NATO. So was Bill Perry, Secretary of Defense Perry. Other people have been hesitant about it as well. Mikhail Gorbachev, who may not be popular in Russia, but he is popular in the United States. But he said back in the 90s, be careful with this. This is not going to be good for Russian democracy or Russia's view of the West. So you don't have to take Putin's side or want to congratulate or support Putin to understand that there is a larger issue here. Unfortunately, I don't see how we can really have the conversation now, again, because of Putin's behavior and the fact that he's threatening Ukraine militarily. Even if it is a bluff, we cannot essentially become more flexible and open-minded at this particular juncture. So we're going to have to muddle through this period and then maybe have a broader conversation later on.
Vladimir Golstein, what do you make of that, given that President Putin has told us on numerous occasions that any NATO involvement in states that neighbor Russia is a threat to Russian security?
Well, I think he's correct, and I would add to what Michael's saying, we shouldn't get fixated with Putin. That Putin, after all, yes, he's a powerful figure, yes, he's been running Russia for quite some time, but, there are, national concerns, and, we should think about it. If he starts acting like, let me call it, weak, if he starts giving in, there are a lot of powerful people, military and others, they will probably do all they could to replace him. So, in other words, don't think that Russia is just willing to jump and get, embraced by the United States and get their politics, economics, and everything changed. This is a country with history, with sovereignty, with pride, and there are people with military, whatever. They also pushing the thing. So they want certain guarantees. They don't want NATO to expand, and I think the United States have to consider their concerns. And another issue is, do we really want, to push Russia in the wrong direction? Do we really want to, by this aggressive behavior, as the United States keeps on pushing? Do they want Russia to be, the friend of some kind of unsavory regime, rather than kind of welcoming it by showing understanding, appreciation, and serious concern for global security? There's also, I think, the issue of China, which, for some reason, rather than sort of kind of thinking about this global, indeed, architecture, United States continue with this Cold War mentality, just Russia is the big villain, Putin is the big villain. I don't think it is productive. And, even if Putin is replaced, I have a feeling there will be somebody who might be, even tougher. So, that's the reality, and Russian concern should be listened to.
Andrij Dobriansky, as the Russian chief negotiator Sergei Ryabkov told us today, Russia has no intention of invading Ukraine, but there are things that Russia can continue to do to destabilize Ukraine, can't it? And we've seen that. There's no NATO rule, for instance, that says that it cannot admit a country experiencing a conflict, a civil conflict. But really, do you believe that NATO is going to enter into negotiations with Ukraine if it has or is in the midst of a civil conflict?
NATO is a alliance of many, many countries, and whatever they decide collectively to do is what happens. There is no conversation with the United States and Russia. As we heard today, Deputy Secretary Wendy Sherman said that these issues today on the conversation have nothing to do with NATO, because NATO has a separate conversation happening this week, as well as the OSCE. Whatever the countries collectively decide, that's what's going to happen, as all countries in NATO collectively decided to promise Ukraine and Georgia a path towards accession in 2008, and again reiterated that twice already. So this is something that's going to happen. What's best for the world is when countries like this work in concert, not when a rogue country like Russia gets to make assassinations on the territory of NATO alliance members, cyber attacks against numerous NATO alliance members with no repercussions. And I would just like to clarify, in the words of the permanent representative of the United States to the United Nations, Ukraine is invaded every day. Every day that there is a Russian soldier on Ukrainian territory, as there has been since 2014, is a daily incursion by Russia onto Ukrainian territory. So this is something that is currently happening, and what we will see is that Russia cannot continue to get away with it if the rest wants to keep the peace in Europe.
Anton, Fedyashin, Russia has made its concerns known. The United States has said no to any kind of veto on future membership and has threatened Moscow with very heavy financial and economic sanctions if there is any kind of invasion of Ukraine. But that does leave the question, are all the cards held by the United States, or does Russia have any leverage?
Well, no, I would say that it's a pretty even match, because look, the West, both the United States and NATO, have made abundantly clear that they're not going to war over Ukraine, and they have very clearly indicated to Russia that it may score military victories against the Ukrainians should, if God forbid a war should begin, and I don't think anyone who's in their right mind has any doubts about that. But then the standoff or the battle will switch over into an economic plane, and there the Russian economy is simply not strong enough to withstand that. But listen, there are, as those of us who are historians know, look, there are many, many different ways of going about pressuring countries. The Russians don't have to invade, as I mentioned earlier. It won't look like the Second World War. If there is a provocation or something that the Russians consider a provocation on the Ukrainian side, the Russian military campaign may take the form of airstrikes, for example. It's not a full invasion, and yet it is at the same time. What's the West going to do in that case? There are many formulas that the Russians can agree with the West. It can be very cynical about the possibility of Ukraine, for example, applying for NATO membership in the future. Right. For example, one such formula could be that Ukraine will have the right to apply to NATO within the borders of 2013. And what are the chances of those borders being restored with the Crimea being part of Russia. That doesn't close the door, so technically it's open, and yet de facto it prevents Ukraine from really applying and becoming a member. Listen, we have to be very cold and understand that when diplomats get down to business, there are many ways of phrasing things that will be both acceptable and slightly unacceptable to all sides. We'll see how it plays out in the next few weeks.
Michael O'Hanlon, the focus of these negotiations will move to Brussels, where the NATO Council will meet with Russian diplomats. And as the Associated Press reports, it said, I'm quoting here, as the Biden administration moves to build international consensus around a set of possible punitive measures, Germany is clearly the linchpin. Securing the support of Europe's biggest economy will be key to both messaging and implementation of whatever is decided. Do you agree with that?
Largely because Europe, of course, is the body, the European Union body that has been applying most of the sanctions against Russia since 2014. What I mean by that is they have far more trade with Russia than we do in the United States, and economic sanctions have been, I believe, probably our more important lever of the last 8 years. We have added military forces in Poland and the Baltic states essentially as a tripwire and an initial defensive capability, but I believe that the real effect has been generated by economic punishment, and Germany, above all, has been the most important economy within that effort, and with the United Kingdom now out of the European Union, I think Germany's role is even greater. But still, France is enormously important. Other major economies in Europe are important because they're going to have to make their decisions by consensus about any future economic punishment. And in particular, if Russia were to invade Ukraine and try to grab a chunk, and I agree with Andrij, I don't think it's very likely, although they might try to grab a swath of southeastern Ukraine and essentially connect their pieces together over to Crimea. But if they do something like a larger land grab, or even what I just said, I think Europe has to be in a position to credibly start to move its energy dependency from Russia to other sources, even at a cost of higher fuel prices. That's the more realistic way to punish Russia. Yeah. It's much better than World War III. And that's where I think that Germany, again, is going to have to be the most important player among a community that makes decisions by consensus.
Vladimir Golstein, I've only got a minute left, but, you know, as Moscow considers its options, what kind of cost-benefit analysis is taking place in the Kremlin right now? How far would they go?
Well, I don't think they will be aggressive with Ukraine. I don't think it's the issue. I think they are very much concerned with NATO, so they would probably try to place as many submarines around the United States just for equality, parity sake, just to see, you know, you might stick, you know, nukes and rockets, you know, into our backyard. We can do the same. Right. So that's what they would probably try to do. And, you know, they probably put an economic pressure on Ukraine, which has to reconsider kind of its position. You know, after all, what Russia is pushing, and many people suggest that Ukraine can be Finland, part of Europe, but not necessarily aligned. Okay. And it will benefit everyone.
And we need to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.